welcome to Genpres, a weekly Danish podcast presented by Nordic Bets. This week is done in an English version as well, as both people I'm speaking to speak in English. I've gone to London to do a program on Crystal Palace, the London club from, to say the least, the non-posh part of South East London. Later in the program I'll be speaking to Guardian journalist Dominic Fifield, who covers the London clubs. He's also a lifelong Palace fan. Firstly, I'll meet Stephen Browett. He grew up close to Selhurst Park, and then later became a millionaire with an import wine business. And when he was a kid, started going to Selhurst Park. He surely didn't think that one day he would buy the club with 3 others and save it from going bust. Welcome.
First, I'm meeting Stephen Browett, one of the owners of Crystal Palace. Previously, you were also one of the directors, but now you're out of the daily running of the club. Firstly, just to explain to my listeners, how did you get involved as an owner in Palace? Because that story's a bit special.
Yeah. Well, Palace went into administration in 2010, where the previous owner couldn't pay his bills and had borrowed money, and the lender of the money not being paid their interest charges, called in the administrators, and Palace was all set to go bust. At that time, Palace was at the bottom of the Championship, and we actually, in fact, survived by coming 4th from bottom, so we were virtually relegated to League One, and there were no other buyers coming in for the club, so 4 Palace fans, me, Martin Long, Jeremy Hosking and Steve Parish, got together and bought the club 25% each, and saved it from going out of business. But our plan was never really to be owners. We didn't really want to be owners. We were reluctant buyers, if you like. So we did very well. We got promoted to the Premier League in 2013 by winning the playoff final. But then we looked for investment from people with more money than us, and we sold a majority in the club in the end of 2015 to a group of American investors.
So it was never the idea to hold on to it and run it?
Well, I think when you get in the Premier League, it's serious money. It's the big time, and we, or certainly 3 of us, are very much fans and don't have a desire to own and run a football club and be famous. That's not what we did it for. Fortunately for the Americans, Steve Parish, one of the 4, has stayed on to actually run the club, because he knows what he's doing. He's a fantastic guy, and he's really essential, I think, because a lot of foreign owners come into the Premier League. You've seen the Americans at Aston Villa and Sunderland, and you've seen Far East people like the guy Malaysian at Cardiff, and they come in and they don't usually do very well.
That's a mild way of putting it.
It's a dangerous business running a Premier League football club, because you've got all this money coming in from TV, but you have to pay massive wages to the players. Our wage bill today at Crystal Palace is 10 times what it was when we were in the Championship. So although there's more money coming in, there's much more money going out. But of course, if you get relegated, it can be a financial disaster, because when that TV money goes, your income is down to possibly even 10% of what it was in the Premier League. And of course, 3 teams get relegated every year, and that is almost always 3 teams out of a possible 10. So, the top 6 are never going to get relegated. Manchester United, Manchester City, the top 6 won't get relegated. Clubs like Everton don't get relegated. In fact, this year it's a bit more of it's a serious competition on relegation. But normally you go into the start of the season where there are 10 teams in the bottom half, if you like, or perceived to be in the bottom half, and 3 of those are going to get relegated. So you've got a 33% chance
and
going
that's including you.
That's including Palace. Always has been including Palace. Palace have never gone into a Premier League season and not been one of the favourites to be relegated. in the past, we've been the classic yo-yo club. You know, you go up, you stay up a season or 2 or even 3, and come down. But currently, we're in our best ever run of actually staying in the Premier League. But it's a battle.
You mentioned before the foreign owners. And is it important to you? And do you think it's important for the Premier League that football clubs are still kind of bound to the local community?
Oh, well, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think so. I mean, I suppose in terms of the global audience watching TV, most of the people watching in, you know, all parts of the world don't actually know where the clubs are. Anyway, you know, people in Indonesia watching and gambling on a Premier League football match probably don't know that Crystal Palace is in South London. You know, it's for them it's not important, but for us, having a sense of identity and representing the area that we come from, and people from South London being proud of the fact that we've got a Premier League football team that's famous throughout the world, I think it's really important. Yeah.
So you're still a football romantic in some ways?
Yeah, I am. I guess other people aren't, but we are South London and proud is our motto, and we feel that we represent the area that we come from.
So with that view on things, how do you feel about the way football has developed in the past 10, 20 years?
Well, it's still, I don't know. I mean, obviously money is massive, particularly in the Premier League, and maybe it's a shame that an English club frequently puts out a team that doesn't have a single English player in the team. You know, if you look at well, all the big clubs really, you know, I don't think there's anyone playing for the Manchester clubs who comes from Manchester. Maybe Man United have got 1 or 2, but I don't think anyone who plays for Manchester City comes from Manchester, and that I think is a shame. But we are, you know, Premier League is the greatest football league in the world, and it's right that it showcases the greatest footballers in the world. So as long as the fans retain the identity of the club, I suppose it doesn't matter that the players don't. Although, you know, we're particularly proud of a guy like Wilfried Zaha, for example, who plays for Palace, who was brought up a few hundred metres from the stadium, and was in the academy from the age of, I don't know, 9 or 10 or something. You know, I think that's a great thing. And
how did you end up a Palace fan yourself?
I just happened to be brought up and went to school in the area. I mean, when I was a kid, I used to walk to the ground. I lived very close, and I guess that coincided with the fact that when I was, and it does with a lot of people, when I was a certain age, 9, 10 years old, which is when kids get into football, Crystal Palace actually were in the old First Division. You know, a lot of Palace fans of my age became fans because Palace actually had a great team in the late 60s, and then of course with the Wright and Bright period in the late 80s, Palace became high profile again. So I got hooked on Palace at a good time. But a lot of my friends at school supported Chelsea, which is another local team. I mean, Chelsea's actually, from where I live, it's equidistant to Crystal Palace. You know, but we've got, within an hour's journey of Crystal Palace, we've got Millwall, Charlton, Chelsea, Fulham, West Ham, Arsenal, Spurs. You know, there's a lot of competition, But I'm glad I made my choice, even if it was a bit unfashionable.
Naming all those local clubs, start with your rivals, because Brighton seem to be a big rival, which is not very local.
Yeah.
So can you explain to me where that comes from?
Well, rivalry in English football is a complicated thing. Sometimes it's easy, like in Sheffield, for example. There's Sheffield Wednesday, Sheffield United. That's quite easy. But on the other hand, in Liverpool, Liverpool's big rivals are not Everton, they're Manchester United. They're the two clubs that particularly hate each other. And the rivalry is often for practical reasons. Crystal Palace in the 1960s and 1970s were almost always in the same league as Brighton. We were very, very rarely in the same league as Chelsea, for example, or West Ham, or Arsenal, or Spurs. So our rivals, traditional rivals, tend to be clubs you played quite a lot. You know, there's no point in say Tranmere Rovers, which is 2 miles from Liverpool, being a rival of Liverpool, because they don't play them. You know, they're a much smaller club in the city. So Crystal Palace and Brighton played each other a lot in the 60s and 70s, and there was very fierce rivalry. They had a manager, Alan Mullery, who became our manager, and there were a few very aggressive matches, and also Brighton need a rival, and of course they haven't got one physically. The nearest club to Brighton is actually Crystal Palace. The next nearest is Portsmouth, but Portsmouth have got the big rivalry with Southampton. So Brighton might have wanted Portsmouth to be their rivals, but Portsmouth didn't want them, because Portsmouth have got their own hatred for Southampton, and Southampton fans hate Portsmouth fans. And then further along the coast you've got Bournemouth. They'd like to be rivals with Southampton, but of course Southampton have got their rivals. So it's all a bit complicated. There are other Crystal Palace fans who feel the big rivals are Charlton, which is very close, or Chelsea, or Millwall. But Brighton is the big one for most fans.
What about, for instance, Wimbledon that you ground shared with? How was that relationship?
Yeah, they don't like us. Wimbledon fans don't like us because they didn't like the fact that they were forced out of their ground by the owners who wanted to make money for property to share with Crystal Palace. But that had nothing to do with Crystal Palace. It was nice of Palace to let them ground share. So they don't like us. We're not really interested. We couldn't care less about Wimbledon. There's no particular animosity amongst Palace fans against Wimbledon. We haven't actually played them that often, and for us it's no big deal.
Today, when you're not involved in the daily running of the business, how much does Palace take up in your head anyway?
Oh, like every fan, it's always there. You can't stop thinking about it when you wake up in the morning. You go on the internet and check if there's any Palace news, and you see what's happening with the club and the players, and you look forward to the next match.
And for you, going to Selhurst Park, what's that like compared to going to other grounds?
Well, Selhurst Park is great because it's an old-fashioned football ground. I love the atmosphere at Selhurst Park. A lot of people say that Palace has got the best atmosphere. It's certainly not the most luxurious stadium. Every stand looks different from the other stand. There's one stand that was built in the 20s, one that was built in the 60s, one that was built in the 70s, and one that was built in the 90s. And the facilities are not brilliant. It's if you don't happen to live in South London, it's not very easy to get to in terms of the road transport anyway. But it's a proper old-fashioned football stadium. The fans are very close to the pitch. The atmosphere, particularly at night games, is great. And I particularly dislike stadiums like Arsenal, for example, where it might be modern with good facilities, but there isn't much atmosphere.
The library.
The library at Arsenal, everyone kind of sits down. if they're 2 or 3-0 up, people start drifting away 20 minutes from the end. You know, it's it hasn't got the soul that Selhurst Park has got.
And you mentioned everybody sits down, but technically you have to sit down still. But I've noticed that one end of the Palace, people stand up kind of anyway, and you've seen that in many clubs. They do that. There's like some sort of tolerance towards it.
You are, if I was the owner of the club, I'd have to say to you, no, that's not allowed. It's forbidden. But all away supporters of all clubs in the Premier League stand throughout the game. So they all break the law, and it's impossible for the stewards to make everyone sit down. At most clubs, particularly at Palace, the more vibrant sections of the home fans also stand. And I think eventually we will have safe standing, probably the rail seats, as they call them, that are used in Germany. I don't know what the different Scandinavian clubs do.
The thing is, in Denmark, for instance, you can in Copenhagen there are seats, but you can stand like just two of the stands. Just basically it says on the ticket, people are standing here.
Yeah.
But rail seats would be better, because if you do what I mean, the seats are just about knee height, so it's not particularly nice if you.
Yeah, so you're banging your knees. Yeah.
So I mean, I think at some point they will probably introduce it, and maybe not at Copenhagen because it's a big ground, maybe smaller grounds where it would be more feasible.
Yeah, English clubs, or certainly most English clubs, would like the freedom to say, right, this area you can stand and shout, make a lot of noise. This area where there's old people and little kids, no swearing, sit down. But we can't. We're not allowed to say that. We officially have to say everybody sits down everywhere.
But there's been a bit of a shift, hasn't there, among the clubs? More seem interested in getting.
I think so. I think most clubs, if they were allowed to have standing sections, would have them.
Yeah.
But it was after the Hillsborough disaster that. Was an awful thing that they brought in the rule where every club in the Premier League and the Championship has to have seats only, no standing. You can still stand in the League One and League Two.
Yeah.
But they brought that in.
But that was when grounds were old and worn down, and I mean.
Yeah, and Hillsborough
that wasn't really bad.
Hillsborough was not really caused by the fact that standing was allowed. It was caused by the fact that far too many people were allowed in.
Yeah.
But to a small space.
It was what triggered it, and but now I mean there are more and more clubs who are interested in getting these rails.
Yeah, I mean in Crystal Palace, if we were allowed to, we would almost certainly make the lower tier of the Homestyle stand a standing section. Yeah. But at the moment, we're not allowed to do it.
And do you have any idea of where it's moving? If it's moving towards it, do you think?
Oh, I think it will happen. But obviously the clubs can't unilaterally introduce that. There has to be legally allowed. But I think it will happen.
As a London club in the big league, you were one of the smaller ones. We've seen Arsenal and West Ham move to bigger ground. Spurs are doing it. Chelsea redeveloping Stamford Bridge into 60,000 capacity.
Yeah.
Are we going to see a similar thing at Palace?
Well, of course, the West Ham move to the Olympic Stadium has been probably an absolute disaster. They had a great traditional stadium, and their fans didn't want to move. But obviously, there's more money in big stadiums. There's more corporate hospitality. So the clubs can. I mean, the clubs. It's a very competitive world, and the clubs need to compete against the other big clubs. And they've got Manchester United, Arsenal, so on have got all this ability to get people to spend £100, £200 on lunch and their hospitality ticket. So you can see why the clubs do it. But I think West Ham have made a mistake. And their fans are very angry. I mean, they're angry about a few things. They're angry about not spending money on players. They're angry about the club's position in the league. But they really don't like being in that round or certainly oval-shaped stadium. Palace will, I am sure, stay at Selhurst Park, which is a proper football ground. We're hoping to build a new main stand to replace the current stand that was built in 1924-25.
That's one of the low ones, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very small. I mean, it's a shame to knock down something that's nearly 100 years old, but it's a very small stand with no facilities for the disabled, not many facilities at all, really. We're trying to get planning permission to build a big new stand there, but it shouldn't change the atmosphere at the club at all, and it will still be a rectangular shaped football ground and not a modern bowl. People don't, real football fans don't really like the worst are the ones with a running track. I mean that's really awful when you've got a football stadium where you've got the pitch and then you've got a running track around the pitch, and then because that's oval shaped, the fans are even further away. So it kills the atmosphere.
Isn't Wembley oval?
No, the old Wembley was. The old Wembley, they used to have greyhound dog racing. They used to have speedway motorbikes on a track around the pitch. The new Wembley it's curved a bit at the ends. Yeah, it is curved a bit at the ends, but not like the old Wembley was. And of course, the Olympic Stadium, they've tried to manipulate it a bit with temporary seating, but I just think it doesn't work as a football stadium. But anyway, the answer to the question is Palace will remain at Selhurst Park.
You'll build a new, different stand that doesn't match the other four either, so it's going to keep it the tradition.
Well, we're trying to get this new stand to blend in a bit with the others, but that doesn't matter for me. For me, the most important thing is it's a proper football ground. It's not a stadium; it's a ground.
What's the difference?
I don't know. A stadium is a modern thing. That's a stadium can hold different sports, and it's a modern construction. A ground is the old-fashioned word, and it's a football ground is where you go to watch your team and have a bit of a shout and a bit of excitement.
We heard Stephen Browett. For me, it was nice to hear that there are still football romantics among the Premiership club owners. I've now sat down with Dominic Fifield, and sorry for the noise, we're in a bit of a loud pub at Gatwick Airport because I'm going home. Dominic's a football journalist at The Guardian, covering the London clubs, and also a lifelong Palace fan. Thanks for being here. Dominic, I met Stephen today. He seems like he's still a football romantic, even though he's part owner of Palace. He talks about the new stadiums, which he dislikes, and refers to Selhurst as a ground. It seems to be a very important distinction for him. What about yourself? Are you still a football romantic?
I'd like to think so. I don't think football counts for much if you don't have that element in it. And I agree with Stephen, and I think a lot of the new grounds can be quite sterile, and we hear a lot of criticism of the atmospheres, even in the Premier League. I know the Premier League has this reputation for having, fantastic entertainment and the Premier League experience, but I think actually people inside the stadium often find the atmosphere quite dull and quite quiet in a lot of the football grounds out there. And Jose Mourinho forever refers to, say, Fratton Park, Portsmouth, as a really raucous football stadium. He's also always complimentary about coming to Crystal Palace, whether he's been there and lost with Chelsea, or won with Chelsea, or come recently with Manchester United and won in the last minute. He's forever complimented the sort of noise that's whipped up by the crowd. It's a traditional football stadium and a traditional football atmosphere, and if we lose that, then God knows what's left, to be honest.
Palace or football in general?
Well, I don't think Palace will lose that. I think football in general. I mean, it has to have that. It has to have something unique about it. And if you're playing in an atmosphere which is like a library, then to be honest, I think that would turn people off watching it on the television as much as it would do people inside the stadia.
You said library, referring to anybody?
Well, there's one that's often used. You know what? I mean, the criticism is always levelled at the Emirates and Arsenal. We've got a situation up the road at White Hart Lane which is being redeveloped at the moment, and part of the motivation behind redeveloping that stadium, apart from all the commercial things, is that club wants to retain an atmosphere. White Hart Lane was always great. It was brilliant atmosphere on a match day. It'd be really interesting to see how the redeveloped White Hart Lane compares atmosphere-wise with the previous version. It'll have twice as many people within the ground, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll have twice as much noise. So we'll see how that goes. And the corporatisation of English football, it can only go so far, because the Premier League is marketed as this amazing atmosphere, and people will see through that and see it as a fraud if it doesn't retain that raucousness that you get at stadia like Crystal Palace, and indeed. And you could argue that a lot of the promoted clubs, like Huddersfield Town, for example, where clubs have come up and it's all new and exciting and vibrant for them, they retain an atmosphere then. But after a few years of struggling, do they retain it? That's the key. If their team isn't winning that many games, does the enthusiasm remain?
I personally have gone to lots of championship games, and I often find there's more of a nerve and more of Rangers, Millwall, obviously, a few others. It's always very noisy. It's not as many tourists, I suppose.
Not as many tourists. That's a massive thing. I mean, huge. It's novel at Palace to see football tourists, but it is happening. It is happening. It's not happening as much as it does at other grounds because there aren't that many tickets available. But that's what the Premier League brings, and Palace have been 5 years in that division now. And I imagine there's a generation emerging of Crystal Palace supporter that is used to being in that division, and whether those guys stay following Palace if Palace slip back into the Championship remains to be seen. But I agree with you. I think the Championship's got some great football clubs, great traditional football clubs. It's got European Cup winners in that division. But they're all aspiring to get out of it, aren't they? That's the bottom line. They all want to get into the Premier League where the money is.
Yeah, the clubs do. I know Millwall fans who are reluctant, even if they're not going to get into the Premiership, but if they went anytime soon, I think. They are seriously worried if they did, they're worried about how much it would cost them to keep their tickets. Would there be too many tourists? Would it be hard to get tickets? I mean, so they're kind of, people I know there seem to be happy in the Championship.
Yeah, and it's a strange one. It's a difficult balance. I think there's an argument that a lot of Premier League clubs, if you take the assumption that maybe 6 or 7 clubs, maybe 8 at most, Premier League teams go into the season knowing they're not going to get relegated, they're not going to go down because they've got enough about them to stay up. That means that 12, 13 are always looking over their shoulder. Now, and inevitably that means that there are going to be periods in those club seasons where they're suffering bad runs of form, where they're losing 5-6 matches out of 6 or 7. They're really struggling, and it's not nice viewing. It's not entertaining. It's grim. There are fans out there now at those clubs, and I've experienced this at Palace, but it happens everywhere, who look at it and think, well, hold on a second. If we were in the Championship, we'd win more than we lose. So we go to a game thinking, well, anything could happen, but we could win this game. There are games in the Premier League where you go thinking, there's no chance of us winning today. Well, let's go damage limitation. If we lose 2-0, it's not a bad result. And that is ridiculous. You don't need that. You don't want that lack of competition. But I think it will create this atmosphere amongst supporters of certain Premier League teams where they do look at the Championship and think, well, there's more merit at being there. The problem is, the flip side of that is when you're in the Championship, and Palace know this as well more than any other club probably out there, the good times only last for so long. They only last as long as the parachute payments last, and you've got something that other clubs don't have. As soon as you slip in amongst all the also-rans in that division, then you're in very grave danger of going the other way, and the financial implications of being down there become very clear. QPR, you mentioned, great atmosphere, but that club financially is in a major... The outlay there and the fact they've only just got the big earners off their wages, having been out in the Premier League for 2-3 seasons, that says everything about where they're at. And that's a club that's got wealthy backers. They can't compete in that division. So you have to balance it. You have to realise sometimes it's, even if you are suffering for periods in the season, it's just nice to be at that top table. You're in a better position than most still.
Stephen, I spoke to him about Selhurst, which you just mentioned before, the redevelopment of White Hart Lane. I mean, the Spurs are doing it. Chelsea's redeveloping Stamford Bridge into 60,000. However they're going to fit that in over the houses and the railroads, I don't know. We'll see. Arsenal has moved. West Ham have moved. Stephen spoke about a new stand, but no intentions of leaving Selhurst. What's your take on it?
Well, I'm as a supporter, I'm happy. As an observer of Crystal Palace from the outside, I don't see where they would have moved. They would have had to have moved outside the M25 probably. There's just the price of property and land in London in that crammed corner of South London is well, it wouldn't have made it possible. This wouldn't have been the option. Even the redevelopment they're talking about of the Sand, I think, is going to cost in excess of £100 million, and that's if they get all the planning permissions through and they manage to get it may amount in compulsory purchase orders for some of the housing around the stadium as it is. But I think it's Palace's heart is at Selhurst Park. If there wasn't the chance, if there wasn't the opportunity to go back to the National Sports Centre on the site of the old Crystal Palace, which is a bit further up in London, only about a couple of miles away from Selhurst Park, but that's where the club was born back in 1905, and the site of the old original Crystal Palace, the Victorian structure up there.
How long ago was that?
1905, and that was built in 1850. Moved there in 1852, I think. It started off in Hyde Park in 1851, and was moved. The Great Exhibition moved to Sydenham Hill in 1852. This colossal glass structure, which you see on Palace's badge, and it burnt down in 1936. And ever since, has been the park is still there, the grounds are still there, and the National Sports Centre was built there, which was a thriving athletics arena until running into hard times. I think we're talking 80s, 90s there. It's still there. It's still an athletics arena, but obviously the London Stadium being what it is now since the Olympics, that's where athletics gravitates towards. And there was always this romantic talk that Palace might one day move back to that site and build a stadium there. The problem is, it's where 4 London boroughs converge. So it's not as if you're just going to one borough and saying, we need transport links coming into this, we need to be able to build on this land. You've got 4 London boroughs converging on the same site. And so it's an impossibility. This was never going to happen. So once that was sort of, once people accepted that wasn't going to happen, then the redevelopment of Selhurst Park was the obvious way to go. And what they've come up with is superb. It was absolutely superb. Potentially, it's mouth-watering. The designs are great. It's kind of very similar to the Anfield redevelopment. It just looks and will be magnificent. It will only increase the attendance, the capacity to a manageable level. They're not turning Selhurst Park into a 45,000 seater white elephant. They're making it into something that can be filled and will arguably still make a difference to their matchday revenues and allow them to compete at a different level on salaries. So everything about it makes sense, and hopefully it comes to pass. But it's one of those ones that, given the sort of planning you have to go through, it's something you have to wait and see to make sure that it does actually happen before you get too excited.
Personally, what I really like about Palace is, and also I spoke to Stephen about, is the way that the stadium is a big mess in a way. It's like 4 different stands from different eras, and I find that very charming. And instead of these new, everything is nice and square and round and whatever.
You know what? The thing about it is it actually reflects the times in Palace's history, moments in Palace's history. The main stand was, I think, the original main stand, pretty much 1928, when they moved there. I think it was around that time. The Arthur Waite is sort of, promotion to the First Division for the first time in the history in the 60s. the Homesdale, after the best period in Palace's history under Steve Coppell in the top division 89 to 93. They redeveloped it, having actually it opened I think in 95 as the Homesdale stand as it is now, and the White Hart Lane actually, which is a smaller stand, but that again reflects it sort of sprung out of the financial disaster that was the early 80s after relegation when the team of the 80s didn't take off. So they're each distinct arenas, it's distinct stands that mark moments in Palace's history, and it is higgledy-piggledy. It is unique in that sense. It's not a neat sort of Meccano stadium like you would get in the new builds. It's got something about a bit of character about it. Only away fans forever complaining, and the facilities are pretty horrendous for away fans, pretty horrendous for home fans in the Arthur Wait as well. But this group of owners, with its American backers as well, I think we'll get round to sorting out those aspects of it, and I don't think they'll lose the charm that it's got.
Let's hope not, because I really like the fact that it's old school. I like that. And there might not be as many toilets or whatever. But
Some toilets might be nicer.
Let's talk about the current season.
And you can take off your journalist hat now and just be a fan. Will you survive?
My heart says we will, because I think that the players, the thing that's done for Palace, other than the awful start, the awful start, is the injuries. Going into the games in March with 12, 13 first team players, and not any old first team players, the key members of their team in the treatment room, was a disaster, and it completely undermined everything that Roy Hodgson had achieved up to then. Palace had actually got themselves up into 12th, 13th place. Then the injuries kick in, and it was a freakish number of injuries. Will Sahar, who's their best player by a country mile, Mamadou Sakho, they've already lost the captain Scott Down, the vice captain Jason Puncheon, the leading scorer Bakary Sakho. Martin Kelly, the centre half, does his hamstring. Jeffrey Schlupp's done his medial ligaments. I mean, it's just Ruben Loftus-Cheek gets an England cap on loan from Chelsea, and the next thing you know, he's limped off against Arsenal at the end of December. He isn't seen again until the middle of March. I mean, it's cruel what happened to them. But those players are coming back now. They go to Huddersfield this weekend with players back to fitness. Johan Cabaye back, Wilf back, Sakho back, Loftus-Cheek back. They'll have the international break to help them get more players fit, and they'll go into their run-in, which is actually quite an appealing run-in. I think they've only got the Liverpool game, and beyond that, they don't play anyone in the top 8 or top 7. And a lot of the teams at the last 2 games are against Stoke City and West Brom. If they have those players fit for those games, Hodgson will get them into safety. If Wilf Sahar succumbs to his 3rd knee injury of the season, if Mamadou Sakho succumbs to calf pain again, or James Tompkins reverts back to the sort of injury-prone centre-half he always was at West Ham, then they're in trouble, because they're going into that run-in in the bottom 3. But I think they've got the quality to survive. It's just a matter of them having the belief that they can do it. And I think Hodgson, all being well, will manage to instill that within them, and they should pull clear.
This is the most amount of years you've been in the best league ever. How critical would it be to go back down?
Well, Steve Parish says it wouldn't be the end of the world, and the Americans would continue to back the club financially and make sure that they could compete to come back out, and the parachute payments would help. But I just think you take 2 steps back if you get relegated. There'd be no chance of keeping Zaha. There'd be no chance of keeping a Sakho, or having players on that wage, an Andros Townsend wage, a Johan Cabaye wage. Benteke is Benteke. Benteke I think will leave anyway. But look, the critical thing about Palace and the way they are at the moment is they're in the Premier League this summer. They can instigate quite a major overhaul of that squad. A lot of them are out of contract. I think Benteke would leave anyway, and they would be able to attack rebuilding with almost a clean bill of health in terms of the wage. the wage bill wouldn't be suddenly be onerous. They'd have freed up a lot of money, and they would be able to compete and bring players in who arguably you could see establishing them in mid-table. If they go down, they lose those players and they cut back on costs. They lose quality in Zaha. There would be other players they would struggle to keep hold of, and they'd have to instigate that overhaul, trying to get people to join a club in the Championship that doesn't really know where it's going. I mean, is it going to be able to compete? They have to rebuild from a position of strength, and that position of strength is as a Premier League club.
The future of Palace, will you keep, if you stay up, will you keep being, as Stephen referred to, one of the 10 clubs always fighting against relegation, or do you think you can make the bump up and be in the top 10?
I think this season has proved there isn't a third tier of sort of group in the middle anymore. There isn't. And the top. Look at the table this year. You take Burnley have had a freakishly good season, they've done brilliantly, but they went through an 11-game run without a win. If they hadn't had such an amazing start, there would be 6 clubs at the top who have been safe all season. Even Arsenal are in that group, but even Arsenal, 6 clubs who would never have been in danger, and the rest of them would have been worried about relegation. Burnley have almost bridged that gap this season, but who's to know whether they can do that again next year? They may well not be able to. In which case, the Premier League, which used to be this 3-tiered structure, is a 2-tier structure. Crystal Palace, with the greatest of respect, the height of their ambition at the moment would be to compete near the top of the 2nd tier. They're never going to break into those sort of, we need to be in Europe every year, because they're just not at that level, and level financially, level commercially, level in terms of their stadium, they're just not there. So the best that they can manage, they can hope for, is upper mid-table, which this season Burnley have done fantastically well. But I mean, even Everton haven't managed to do it particularly convincingly, have they? I mean, it's just Leicester City were Premier League champions 2 years ago, and suddenly they're thinking that finishing 7th or 8th this season would be a major achievement. Well, it's weird how football goes, but that is where Palace can aspire to be. And I suspect that every club, at the start of a Premier League season now, other than that top 6, thinks, okay, we need to get to 40 points first, and then anything we get above that is a bonus. And that's where Palace will be for a long, long time to come, I suspect.
We're going to talk about your club's last transfer window. You bought a guy from Midtjylland called Sørloth, and I can tell you it was quite a story when it came out that Palace had paid, well, what Palace had paid for him, or at least the potential sum if he succeeds. There's a lot of bonuses and whatever. I know Paris doesn't come out with numbers, but numbers are out in Danish press. Where they got them from, I don't know. But £52 million seems to be the top sum. But that is if he, I suppose, plays many games, gets to the national team so and so often. But I mean, and I think the lower number would be £7 or £8 million. What did you think of that purchase? Because Danish people thought it was a lot of money for a guy who had 6 months of a good run.
It all needs context. Jeffrey Schlupp cost Palace £13 million. Patrick van Arneholt cost them about £13-14 million. Premier League clubs play over the odds. That's what they do. Premier League clubs have got the money to do that. They can also spread the cost of those outgoing transfers over the length of the player's contract, so it hardly touches the sides when it comes to the books.
It's a bigger thing. It's a bigger thing in Denmark than here. It'd be like, yeah, whatever. It doesn't really matter here.
Well, yeah, and it's crazy to say that, but it is the case, unfortunately. What is more key over here is the wage that they pay, because that is something that goes out every month from a club's books, and that they have to comply with financial fair play within the Premier League on wages. But to bring someone in from the Danish league is not going to be on the type of wages that's going to affect that particularly. I mean, when you've got someone like Christian Benteke who's earning £150,000 a week, or Wilfried Zaha earning about that as well. So even though the money looks big, it's just not big in terms of Premier League. It's the type of money that Premier League clubs seem to write off. There's a Premier League club currently competing in the relegation scraps that's paid just marginally less than the top fee quoted there to take one player on a season-long loan from a rival Premier League club. So that puts it into context. That is what Premier League clubs are spending at the moment. I'll be intrigued to see how well he does, Sorloth, because he started very well. He's looked as if he has something about him. In the second half at Stamford Bridge, when Palace lost there last week, it was Benteke who came off, not Sorloth. Sorloth stayed on, and I think Roy Hodgson's looked at him and thought, you know, if I have everybody fully fit, I would like Sorloth to be leading my line with Zaha and Townsend next to him. That's how well he's done. That's how the impression that he's made. You know, it would have done him the world of good to have had that goal stood at Stamford Bridge, which was wrongly disallowed, in my opinion, for a foul by a teammate. I don't think it was a foul. So he's very unlucky, and he needs to get off the mark just to calm himself down more than anything else. But at first glance, he looks as if he's got something about him. It may take him a while. He wouldn't normally have had this run in the team, but Palace's injuries have dictated that he got the starts that he has. I hope it comes off.
Do you prefer to buy like 3 players with potential for 5 million instead of one for 15, and then also have the lower wages? Is that better for Palace, you think?
Yeah, but it's also impractical. I think the reality of the Premier League now is that if you buy 3 players at £15 million rather than 1 player for 50 million, then you might feel the benefits. But if you bring in 3-5 millions, you've got to really hit the jackpot on those 3 to make a difference. Squad players don't only take you so far. Palace's big problem this season is they just haven't had the depth of quality. You take out 1 or 2 of the better players, and suddenly you're asking, you know, people like Chung Yong Lee to play a major part in a relegation campaign, and it's asking too much. And he was in his prime, he might have been worth 3 or 4 million, but Palace got him for under £1 million. Obviously for a club, if it thinks it can find 3 unpolished gems at £5 million, and then they can be transformed into 15-20 million pound players by good coaching, then great. But the reality is, Palace change their manager every 5 minutes. These players are often stockpiled because the new manager might not fancy them as much as the previous manager did. And it just doesn't work as a concept anymore. A squad player these days costs around £10-15 million if they're going to be a decent squad player in the Premier League. It's just the reality of the league, unfortunately.
Another transfer story that, to be honest, made Palace a bit of a laughing matter in Danish media was the attempt to buy a Brøndby goalkeeper 20 minutes before deadline. He's on the national team. Well, not the first choice. That would be Schmeichel, of course. But also Brøndby then came out and said that this was the second window in a row where Palace tried to buy him within minutes of the window closing. The same player, 2 windows in a row. It made the club seem, in Danish media, rather unprofessional. What do you think of that sort of strategy?
Well, I don't think Crystal Palace, and I think Steve Parish might even admit this, perhaps only privately, but I don't think Crystal Palace covered themselves in glory in the last 2 transfer windows. With their sort of brinksmanship, the way they played it. The reality is, they've had priorities to add goalkeepers to the books in the last 2 windows, and their principal target has fallen through at the last minute, or they've been unable to land them, which has prompted this desperate scramble to try and bring in the lad from Brøndby, which doesn't sound good. It doesn't put them in a good light. It doesn't show them in a good light at all. The most recent window in January, they had a deal agreed in the summer for Vicente Gaeta at Getafe under the Bosman ruling, and they just thought that towards the end of the window, Getafe might sell him now because they want to get a fee for him. They won't get anything for him in the summer. So I think going into that last day, they thought there's a really good chance that Getafe will cave here and that we'll get our man. And as it turned out, Getafe stuck to their guns, quite rightly. It's completely their prerogative to do that. And Vicente Gaeta will see out the season with them in Spain. and then come to Palace on the 1st of July and under the Bosman ruling for nothing. That is all agreed, but the reality is that it left Palace with only 2 goalkeepers, senior goalkeepers on their books, when the transfer deadline was approaching. So they went in and tried to get your Danish international and got knocked back on that, because there's no reason. Why should the side sell one of their best players, with minutes to go, so they can't buy a replacement? Inevitably, then a week later, Julian Speroni, one of the 2 senior goalkeepers, does his knee ligaments. So Palace end up with 1 goalkeeper and then end up having to bring in Cavalieri from freedom of contract to see them to the end of the season. So they've now got 2 senior goalkeepers, and Speroni will be back soon enough. So they'll have 3 on their books to sort of paper over the cracks until the summer. But
it also means that Ronald, the name of the guy,
yeah,
he can kiss a Palace switch goodbye.
Well, quite
I'd
possibly.
love if you went, because I'm Copenhagen supporter, so I'm happy with him there.
Well, look, to be honest, Palace will need two top quality goalkeepers if they're in the Premier League next season. Maybe they go back in and try and get him, but then he's competing with Gaeta for first choice, and he may not get as many games as the other fella. I think there's a logic that Palace do go back in for him, but I imagine it will happen about 10 minutes before the transfer deadline closes again at the end of August. I mean, it depends on what division they're in. Palace, as I say, there are a lot of changes that will be instigated in that squad in the summer, and the goalkeeper is just one of them.
Last thing here, what do you foresee for Palace future? What is the view?
Well, it all depends on which division they're in, really. If their quality tells over the remainder of the season, they stay up. I think Roy Hodgson will stay next season, which I think is the key. You need a manager who's going to be there for a while. And I know Roy's out. For whatever reason, I mean, Pardew's probably been the nearest they've come to having a manager stick about, and that just went horribly wrong over a course of 10 months, really, and went on too long in the end. But they need a bit of stability in that respect, so that someone can build something that will sustain them. But we all know Roy Hodgson's, he's not going to be around, long term. He's an old man, and he's done brilliantly well, but he's not someone that's going to be there in 5 years' time. Football clubs in this country don't behave like that anyway these days, to be honest. But there does need to be a bit of continuity. There has to be a clear strategy as to what happens next if they're in the Premier League, and Roy is the man to help them do that. Dougie Freedman is there, which, if he's given leeway to make his mark, then I think he will have a positive impact on the club in terms of the direction it takes. And I think there's a lot of positives as a Premier League club. There's a lot of it's exciting times. In terms of the stadium, I think the fan base will continue to build. It will be a club that tries to promote safe standing, which will be a big thing in English football. I think the atmosphere will be retained. I think it can be really exciting. If they go down, they've got to try and retain as much of that level of enthusiasm as they possibly can. There'll be a realism in terms of what happens to Wilf, what happens to some of the higher earners. Of course they will, but they can't give up on the ambition. And I don't think they will. Steve Parish is one of the most committed co-chairman out there. He is guiding the Americans through what needs to happen at a Premier League football club. They're not used to that, and there's a lot going right. But it would be a hell of a lot easier to instigate all the improvements that they want to do if they're in the Premier League still.
Dominic, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure.
And that was the podcast for this week. We'll be back next week in Danish, probably more in English a bit down the line. Next week will be gibberish for most English listeners. But thank you for listening.